So, when you think of Ulysses S. Grant, you probably picture the stoic general, right? The determined president. But what if I told you his greatest battle wasn't actually fought on a battlefield at all? What if it was fought at a writing desk, in a race against time itself? Today, we're diving into the incredible story behind his famous memoirs, and you're going to meet a man who was, well, reluctant, deeply moral, and surprisingly, incredibly human. He kicks off his memoirs with these exact words: "Man proposes and God disposes." And man, does that line just perfectly capture his life. A life that was constantly shaped by events far beyond his own choosing. It's a theme you see again and again in his story, right up to the very, very end. All right, so to understand these memoirs, we're not starting on some Civil War battlefield. Nope, we have to jump forward, all the way to 1885. The war, that's a distant memory. Grant is a national hero. But behind the scenes, he's fighting a totally different kind of war, a personal one, a series of catastrophes that, honestly, would crush most people. I mean, just try to imagine the weight of all of this. First, you're financially wiped out by a con artist. Then, a bad fall leaves you stuck in your house. And then, the final, devastating blow, a diagnosis of incurable throat cancer. Grant himself said he was living upon borrowed money. So yeah, from this place of just absolute desperation, he decides to do the one thing he swore he'd never do: write his story. And it wasn't for glory. It was simply to make sure his family would be okay after he was gone. But this raises a huge question, right? This man who had become such a gifted writer, how in the world did he end up in the military in the first place? And that's where you find the central paradox of his entire life. America's greatest general, well, he never even wanted to be a soldier. And look, those aren't my words, they're his. He couldn't have been clearer about it. There was no boyhood dream of military glory, no burning ambition to climb the ranks. So the obvious question is, why on earth did he go? It's the big question, right? If he had zero desire to be there, what could possibly get him into the country's top military academy? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple: his dad. And you gotta love the honesty of this story. There was no big shouting match, no dramatic debate, just this simple, firm statement from his father. And Grant's reaction is just, well, it's almost funny in how dutiful it is. He knew who was in charge. It's really one of the first signs you see of that sense of duty that would define his entire life. But duty wasn't the only thing pushing him. For a kid from a small town in Ohio, the real carrot on the stick was something we can all relate to: travel. The idea of getting to see the great cities of New York and Philadelphia, that was, in his own words, enough to convince him to go. It was never about becoming a general. It was about seeing a bit of the world. So he joins the army, and his first real combat experience is in the Mexican-American War. Now, you'd probably expect a young officer to be all fired up with patriotism, wouldn't you? But Grant's take on that war is, well, it's absolutely stunning. Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't some historian looking back with a critical eye. This is Second Lieutenant Grant, while he's a part of the war, calling it one of the most unjust ever fought. I mean, that shows you he had this incredibly strong moral compass, and he wasn't afraid to question authority, even as a young guy just starting out. And this is where you really see how sharp he was. See, the official government line was that this was all just a simple border dispute, but Grant saw right through it. He called it a conspiracy to grab land and create more slave states. He wasn't just some soldier blindly following orders. Even back then, he was a pretty savvy political observer. So even in these early days, long before the Civil War, you can see the core of the man he was going to become. And sometimes, the clearest glimpses you get of someone's character come from their biggest mistakes. He tells this hilarious story on himself, a painful but funny lesson he learned when he was only about 8 years old about the art of making a really, really bad deal. Okay, so his dad sends him to buy a horse that he desperately wants. The instructions are crystal clear. Start your offer at $20, and if you have to, you can go as high as $25. But young Grant, in all his earnestness, walks right up to the owner and just lays his entire negotiating strategy out on the table. As he later wrote, it would not require a Connecticut man to guess the price finally agreed upon. And the best part? The humiliation just stuck with him. The fact that the great future general got completely fleeced as a kid. It's what makes him so incredibly human. He wasn't born a master strategist. He learned his lessons the hard way, just like the rest of us.
All right, let's bring it all back to 1885. Back to that dying man in the chair, scribbling away against the clock, with all these life experiences, that sense of duty, that moral clarity, even the memory of his past failures, all of it fueling him.
He took that same relentless focus he used to besiege Vicksburg and turned it on himself, on this book. He was in constant, agonizing pain from the cancer, so bad that sometimes he couldn't work for weeks. And yet, he just kept pushing, day after day, absolutely determined to finish. And this timeline, wow, it just shows you what an incredible race against time this was. He gets diagnosed in late 1884, he writes nonstop, finally signing the preface on July 1st, 1885. He died just 22 days later. It's like he literally held off death itself just long enough to write those last words. So what did he pull off in that final, desperate year? This wasn't just a few articles. He wrote 2 complete, masterful volumes. It was this monumental achievement that became an instant bestseller and secured his family's future for generations. In the end, Grant's final battle wasn't at Appomattox or Shiloh. It was fought silently, with a pen, against pain and time. It was a victory not for a nation, but for his wife and children. And in that final, desperate fight, Ulysses S. Grant won. So it all leaves us with this one question. Knowing that he was a reluctant soldier, a sharp critic of an unjust war, and a man who fought his last battle not for glory but for the love of his family, how does that change the way we see that stoic general in the history books?